Is USA staring at a financial catastrophe? Economics is based on some basic, fundamental assumptions. There are goods and services that are produced, and they have a certain value associated with them. They can be purchased by the consumers, by providing a price, equivalent to its value, as determined by the market. The price is elastic, which means, it can vary based on many factors, that control the value. What if we don't have enough money to purchase a specific set of products or services? Well, the answer is simple. We borrow money, essentially the difference of what we need, minus what we have. Once we borrow, we must deal with repaying the debt within a specific time frame, along with the interest. If the amount cannot be paid as a single lump sum, a repayment structure is established, where you pay a specific small amount regularly, usually, on a monthly basis. This whole concept of borrowing is applicable, in a very similar fashion, for sovereign nations as well. Just like individuals who plan their expenses and budget them, nations need to budget their projected revenues and expenses. This is usually done on an annual basis. If the expenditures are higher than the revenue earned through various forms of taxation, we call the difference as budget deficit. This deficit amount is borrowed from various sources, and gets added to the national debt. National debt is the total amount of money owed by the nation, to various parties, who have paid towards the nation's borrowings. It's important to note that the national debt is never looked at, in isolation, but as a ratio of debt to its GDP, or gross domestic product. That brings up the question, what is GDP? GDP is the total market value of all the finished goods and services, produced within a country's borders, in a specific time period, measured usually for a year. Expressed as a mathematical equation, GDP is the sum of all private consumption, private and government investments, government spending, and the difference in external trade, which is exports minus imports. Why do we look at the ratio of debt to GDP, instead of looking at just the debt alone? As you know, a billionaire can borrow $100 million for running his business, and it may not affect the billionaire as much, since he has a better capability of repaying it, but it's not the same for an average person, borrowing the same amount. Similarly, if a nation has a higher GDP, then it can withstand a higher debt. So, the debt to GDP ratio is more important than the national debt in absolute terms. Anyway, let's look at the problem of US debt in detail. In the year 2000, the US national debt was around $5 trillion. The US government also recorded a budget surplus of $0.24 trillion, or $240 billion. In other words, the amount of revenue collected by the government exceeded the amount of money spent by the government. During the US presidential debates, in 2000, between Gore versus Bush, a large section of the discussion focused on how the budget surplus, which was expected to keep growing for years to come, will be handled by the incoming president. It does look incredible, and funny at the same time, when you think about it today, seeing how the actual events turned out, in the next 22 years, and most likely, in the coming years as well. In 2001, US was hit by a terrorist attack on September 11, which deepened a recession that had already started a few months earlier. In the next few years, USA was also involved in two costly wars, in Afghanistan and Iraq. All of these events, along with the tax cut given during Bush administration, created budget deficits every year of his 8-year presidency, and this caused a gradual increase in the debt levels of USA. The US budget deficit reached its highest $3.13 trillion in 2020, and $2.77 trillion in 2021. It's obvious this was a result of the economic devastation that was caused by the pandemic. However, economics is based on numbers, and it doesn't ask for explanations. The effects of such spending can still make the country have severe long-term consequences. As we have seen earlier, in the year 2000, the national debt of US was hovering around $5 trillion. And the debt-to-GDP ratio was a little over 50%. At that time, US was sitting on a pulpit, and had the authority to preach to the rest of the world about financial discipline, and the world would listen attentively. US was considered as a model country for the rest of the world to aspire and emulate. In fact, the top US credit rating agencies which determine how healthy a country or company is, were cautioning how a country should never raise the debt levels to a level above the debt-to-GDP ratio of 2/3, or 66%, under any circumstance. In fact, such strict guidelines are still expected to be followed by many developing countries, as stipulated by the rating agencies. Of course, US has thrown such guidelines to the trash can for a long while now. In the year 2022, the US national debt went past $30 trillion. That is $25 trillion more than the $5 trillion in 2000. The debt-to-GDP ratio reached almost 130%. Of course, about $7 trillion of this debt was caused due to the pandemic, but the remaining $18 trillion of the debt was accumulated during the course of the period between 2001 till 2019, before anyone knew there was a pandemic coming. The question is, how did a country like US become so debt-ridden, and is it possible for the US to become burdened by this debt, and buckle under its weight? Let's answer the first question first. In any true democracy, politics is all about pleasing people, and winning their votes. In the process of pleasing the people, the US politicians, including the president and the congressmen, did a lot of spending, with no additional revenue collection, through increased taxes, or offsetting the expenses, through reduction in other areas. This is the perfect recipe for the debt reaching higher and higher. The debt was increasing during the two terms of both the US presidents, George W. Bush, as well as Barack Obama. While Bush almost doubled the debt from around $5 trillion to over $10 trillion in 8 years, which was an increase of $5 trillion. Though the main reasons were the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, there was a housing crisis in 2008 that created a big hole in the budget in the last year of Bush's presidency. Not to be outdone, Obama doubled it again, and made it rise above $20 trillion, an increase of $10 trillion this time. During Obama's period, there was a huge amount of spending to pull US out of recession in the early years, and on government-assisted healthcare spending, called Obamacare, later. The country was divided along party lines, and people, media, and the politicians kept blaming the other party for all the economic troubles. However, it must be noted, the debt was going up and up, irrespective of which party controlled the presidency, US House, or Senate, the main arms of power within the US government. The debt has now reached such high levels that people seemed to have become desensitized to it. Nobody seems to care anymore. When Donald Trump came to power, he executed another huge tax cut, helping the corporates and individuals, with no reduction in any spending. Of course, the idea of such tax cuts is, it will help additional flow of money back into the economy, and offset any revenue loss to the government. But it didn't happen exactly as expected. These measures under Trump added another $3 trillion to the US national debt, before the nation experienced the pandemic. Needless to say, the pandemic made the situation much worse. Since 2000 to 2022, the debt-to-GDP ratio of the United States rose from a mere 55% to a staggering 130%. To put it in perspective, this ratio is worse than the World War II spending by US, which was about 120% in 1946. Remember, back then, US was still able to help out Western Europe with their Marshall Plan, because they had many factors going in favor at that time. Since the US, the role model of capitalism, followed this trajectory of increasing their debt, all the other countries emulated the same style of spending and debt increase, like the US did. So, UK, France, China, Japan, and many others followed suit, increasing their national debt. Of course, USA is still a role model when it comes to economics. However, this time, the path followed by US is not what it has been preaching for a while. Let's get into the second question. Has the US debt risen to such high levels that US is heading towards a financial Armageddon? Well, the answer is very complicated and will vary based on whom you ask. Some believe that US has the capacity to keep raising the debt levels, and there will be no consequence to their actions. After all, the US dollar is the reserve currency of the world. So, most international trade is done with US dollars, and this puts the US currency in a unique situation. Though the UK pound, euro or the Japanese yen, and a few more, are not international reserve currencies, they enjoy free exchange with the US dollar, and hence have some degree of protection as well. Despite the steady increase in the ratios of debt to GDP, US and its allies are given a high sovereign credit rating by the rating agencies, and most of these agencies are based in the United States. Sovereign credit ratings are a grade given by the credit agencies, which influence the rate of interest that needs to be paid by the borrower, and in this case, the country itself. It doesn't take too much effort to realize how the macroeconomics, which should impact the ratings, are deliberately set aside by the rating agencies. The sovereign credit ratings are left untouched for most part for US and its allies, ignoring all fundamentals, whereas even a slight slip by other nations will meet with a harsh treatment on their credit rating. Though the behavior of credit rating agencies can be regarded as blatantly unfair, this explains the stand taken by some in the US, who ignore the increasing level of US debt. The extremely low interest that the US pays servicing its debt makes most people very comfortable with the idea of borrowing. And then, there is the other side of the argument. Some predict that the US debt is so high, and if left unchecked, it can destroy the foundation of the US economy, as we know it. These people say that the US debt creates a few issues. First, the interest paid will become a higher and higher component of spending in the budgets for many years to come. In other words, the interest payment may include a big chunk of their annual spending. There is no argument here. This is 100% true. Second, the trust in US dollar may be eroded, with increase in debt levels, and will eventually lead to the removal of the US dollar as the reserve currency. At a minimum, the reserve currency may become a basket of many currencies, instead of just the US dollar. Currently, many countries buy the US debt, in the form of treasury bonds, in an effort to boost their foreign currency reserves, but that will be greatly reduced if the US dollar is either not the only reserve currency, or replaced by another monetary unit entirely. If there is less demand for the US debt, then the interest paid on them, known as yield, will need to increase, to attract the investors. This can lead to higher chunk of the budget being spent on interest payment, thereby limiting the ability for the central government to focus on other spending. Many of the sufferings of the developing world is due to its budget being consumed by interest payments on their national debt. The US can buckle under its own weight of debt as well. So, it's no laughing matter, and needs to be taken very seriously. We believe that this view has a much higher probability, especially if the debt rise is left unchecked. Third, there is only finite amount or quantity of all commodities, including food, along with metals like gold, silver, copper, iron, etc., but the debt adds more money into circulation, resulting in a higher price for all commodities which are in finite supply. This is called inflation. We'll do a separate video on the increased money supply and its effect on US inflation. Since US has dodged the consequences of high borrowing for so long, there is a certain level of calmness in many people's minds. However, there is no guarantee that the future will stay the same. We hope the seriousness will be understood by all responsible parties, including the people, and corrective actions will be taken on time. Thanks for watching.